Hey everybody, welcome back to the REPS program. Today we're going to be talking about lease options. Okay, so lease options are one of my favorite technique, and I'm going to get into a lot of details and explain why. But we're going to do a quick review just so I can catch everybody back up to the beginning foundational class, some of the things we talked about. I'm not going to go into that depth, but I want to do a quick review on what is a lease options. And we're going to jump right into it and talk about how I use lease options, how you guys can use lease options, and all the many different ways there are to profit from lease options. Again, lease options are probably one of my favorite technique, and they can work in almost any situation. So really quick, a lease option is it's basically a rent to own. So if you're on the buying side of a lease option, meaning you found a property, you're trying to do a very low or no money down technique, or just getting into the property just as cheap as you possibly can, lease options work great. And really, we're going to go through the details on that. But in simplistically thinking, all it is you're buying it on a rent to own. Okay, you take over the payments. You're then making that payment to that seller, or I'm going to show you how to do that to the bank so that you know the payment's made. You buying it for a certain amount of time, and eventually there's a day where you come in and cash out. When you cash out, you're selling the property, or you're getting bank financing put in place. So you've bought the property. You're in a buying scenario. You're buying it usually to either flip it, which is maybe 20%, 10 to 20% of the time, or you're renting it out and getting a cash-on-cash return. You're creating cash flow. You're getting a chunk of money down, renting it out, and then 2 to 3 years later or sooner, you've got that option. You're cashing that seller out, and you're either selling the property, refinancing it, or flipping the property. Now, if you sell the property on a lease option, and this is where most investors use lease options, they buy a property. Let's say they pay cash or they use financing. And they don't want to worry about the two biggest, ways to ruin your investment, as we talked about in the rental segment, where the two things, if you remember right, the two things that can ruin your investment as a rental property is maintenance and vacancy. Well, lease options eliminate that. So now you've got a property, you bought it. Let's say you bought it distressed, you rehabbed it, you paid cash or got financing or whatever it is. You rehabbed it, got it rent ready. You did a lease option instead of a regular rental. You got a chunk of money down. That tenant that now lives in there is going to buy that property from you eventually, let's say over a 3-year period. You're going to help them with getting their credit fixed, help them with finding a mortgage broker that can then help them get a mortgage on the property to cash you out. You collect cash flow that whole entire time that you've owned that property, and then eventually one day you get a one lump sum for the equity of that property. And so think about it. It's this is why I love selling properties on lease options. You got a down payment down. You got monthly cash flow the entire time you owned it. You didn't have to worry about vacancy. You didn't have to worry about any maintenance cost. And then 2 to 3 years later, whenever that person cashes you out, you got a lump sum. It's perfect best case scenario. But also think about it on the buyer's side of their point of view. Think about this. So they gave you a down payment. They were able to buy a house, call it their own, and they didn't have good enough credit to qualify for bank financing. So they got to own a home for a small down payment. They got a couple, 2, 3 years to cash you out while they were fixing their credit. Otherwise, they would have been renting and throwing away that money every month. And 3 years later, they've got bank financing. You helped them find those people. They cash you out. Now the home is technically in their name, and they have their own bank financing. So it's truly a win-win. That's one of the best parts. It's like when you're really thinking about it, whether you're buying or selling on a lease option, the best part is regardless of which strategy you're using, it's a win-win scenario. So I love lease options for that point. So let's jump into it. So if you're buying on a lease option, we're going to talk a little bit about that in the beginning. One of the ways that I decide, and I use the lease option technique, is on buying. Let's say you are working with very little money or no money, or you're in a tighter margin deal. So what I like to say is when you're buying it, usually there's a tighter margin. Okay, what do I mean by tighter margin? So let's say you're working on a deal and you can't quite get the deal cheap enough to wholesale it, but it's still a pretty good deal. For example, if it's a $100,000 house, and just for easy numbers, let's say that this is a $100,000 house, and that's the ARV. We talked about all of this stuff before, and let's say that the repairs are $20,000, and I'm just throwing up some easy numbers here, and you're able to buy this property at, let's say, 60 to 70,000. Let's call it 65,000. Okay, so this is your purchase price. Now that might not be cheap enough to wholesale it. In some markets, that might be good enough. Let's say you could even call this 70,000, but it might not be cheap enough to wholesale. Or maybe you've had it under contract and you haven't had any buyers take because the margins are just too tight. Depending on where you're at in the country, though, this could work fine. So, but you can still see there's equity here. There's a deal to be had there. This is where I'll transition this deal into a lease option, because even though I necessarily can't wholesale it, I go back and figure my numbers, and we're going to get into the ROI and figuring out your cash on cash return a little bit later. But even though you've got some equity there, if you could get into this deal cheap enough and you didn't have to put out a lot of money, it still might make sense to turn into a lease option, to sell for full ARV down the road and capture all your equity at that point. So I might try to do, in this particular case, let's say I'm negotiating with a seller and I can't quite get it cheap enough. I want to buy this, let's say the wholesale price, as we went through those numbers. In order to get the wholesale price, I'd really want to buy this thing at about half of ARV. Okay, so around $50,000. But I'm at 65, and the seller can't go any less. Maybe the seller owes $65,000. So what I'll do is I'm negotiating, and I'm going to teach you guys a key phrase that you must get, literally ingrain it into your mindset and have it. Always, it's a tool. This phrase will help you get lease option after lease option after lease option. I've been using this phrase for years, and it always works. But we're going to talk about it in a second. So let's say you know that the wholesale price is $50,000. You can't get there. You can get it at $65,000, but let's say the owner owes $65,000, so he can't physically go any less anyway. But there's still equity here. So as I'm talking to the seller and I make my offer and I say, hey, the best I can do is $65,000, or the best I can do is $50,000. Seller says, I can't go that low. I owe $65,000. $65,000 is my lowest price. I'll say this. I'll say, well, what are you going to do if it doesn't sell? What are you going to do with this house if it doesn't sell? Because you've got a motivated seller on your hands. What are you going to do if it doesn't sell? If that buyer says, or that seller, I should say, if that seller says, I don't know, I guess I'll just have to try to rent this thing out. That is a key phrase you're trying to get. So again, I say, what are you going to do if it doesn't sell? So you should be using this phrase anytime you're in a situation. Remember back to this video. Anytime you're in a situation where you're trying to negotiate, you know where the wholesale price is, you can't get it cheap enough to wholesale, but you've still got to deal with equity built in. Always remember back to this. Always say, well, what are you going to do if it doesn't sell? If that person just says, well, I guess I just have to rent out the property, then you want to roll with that. So I'll say, oh, really? Well, what do you think you could get for rent? And a lot of times that seller is going to list off a very low rent number. So let's say that in perfect scenario, just for easy numbers here, in a perfect scenario, this house would rent for $1,000 a month. Okay, let's just say that's the number that on average that this house could rent for. that seller's usually not going to know the top of the market rents. They're just not in the business. They don't really know. They don't have the tools and the knowledge that you guys have. A lot of times these desperate sellers, they don't know. They'll throw out a number, and a lot of times it'll be much less. So they'll say, well, I can, you know that you could rent this house for $1,000. They'll say, well, I bet I could get $650 per month for rent. So, again, what are you going to do if it doesn't sell? I don't know. I guess I'd have to rent it out. Well, what do you think you could get for rent? I don't know. I could probably get, $650 to $700 a month. So I would then say, well, I don't know if $650 per month rent would work for me. I could probably do $450 a month. So you're rolling. This seller's not even really expecting you to say this. But what you're doing here is you're rolling this seller into selling this house for cash, which won't work, into you're now going to buy it on payments, on rent payments. Okay? So, again, I'll say something along the lines is, hey, I don't know if $650 would work for me. The best I could do is $450 a month. What you're trying to do in this case is you're just trying to get the rent number as low as you possibly can. Because the lower you can get this rent number, the more cash flow you can create, the bigger the spread. So you know that in this particular case, if you can kind of figure out most of the time how much a payment is going to be for the mortgage payment. If that person's got a mortgage and they owe $65,000, you could quickly jump and grab your phone and plug in some easy numbers. Most sellers have loans of 30-year amortizations. You could even ask them what their current payment is, because I'm trying to take over as a buyer of a property, trying to buy something on a lease option. I'm trying to take over their payment. Okay, so I'm going to get this number as close to their payment as possible. Sometimes I'll even tell them, I'll just take over your payment. So if you're willing if you want to rent this property out, I'd be willing to rent to buy it. I can't pay cash for it because I can't get it for my price. But I would be willing to buy it on a lease option. So I'll take over your payment. And I'll take over all your maintenance costs, and I'll take over the taxes and then the insurance and everything, and this headache will be off your plate. So what I know now I'm getting this property for $450 a month. I know I can rent it for $1,000 a month. So and I'm going to get into more of the details in a little bit, but let's say taxes are $150 a month, insurance maybe $50 a month, so $50 per month in insurance, and all your other expenses, your maintenance cost, you're taking over all that. You're taking this off the plate of this seller, and they love it in most cases. And so what you can do is you can make that payment directly to their bank, because the worst thing you can think of is you make that payment to them, and then they pocket it and they never pay the mortgage. And then what happens is that the house goes into foreclosure and you're kind of the last one to know. So you don't want that scenario. So you'll pay that mortgage payment directly to their bank. You'll pay the taxes directly to the county. You'll pay the insurance directly to the insurance company. And then you're taking over that maintenance cost. Maintenance, we usually figure at $70 a month on a single family home on average. So quickly you can see you got $450. You got $150 into taxes, $50 into insurance, let's say. So you're up to $650 plus maintenance. Call it $700. Throw $100 for maintenance, $750. You got a $250 spread. If you manage it yourself, you don't have a management fee. If you hire a property management company, you've got a small fee there. But you just created instant cash flow. You take over this deal, you get it rent ready. And all of a sudden, out of thin air, you've got monthly cash flow coming in on a deal with no money down. Now, the only thing you've got to handle is if there is a repair cost. If you've got some repairs to do, you have to do that out of your pocket. But a lot of times, in many cases, if you're turning this into a rental property versus a fix and flip, you don't have to put as much money into the repairs as you would a fix and flip if it's a rental property. A lot of times you can clean and paint and get it done a lot cheaper. The other thing you can do is turn this property over to another investor at that point, because now you've got equity. Sometimes if you have absolutely, you can grab a partner to help you pay for maintenance, the repairs. Or you can turn the deal over to another investor and sell the lease option and basically assign your lease option contract and make a couple of grand that way too. Because there's always going to be investors looking for these deals. So there's so many different ways to move on this. But you can see where you can have a lot less money involved and no down payment. One of the biggest things is no down payment on this deal. So you can create a couple $100 a month in cash flow almost instantly overnight, as soon as you rent it out, and then you're into the deal with no money. So, again, the biggest thing is the key phrase is what are you going to do if it doesn't sell? Use that to lead that into the conversation. Let them discover the answer. Well, I'd have to rent the property. So now it's their idea. Okay, great. Well, I might be interested in renting this property from you. What do you think you can get for rent? Well, I think I could probably get about $650 to $700. I don't think I'd be willing to pay you $650, but maybe I could take over your payments or give you $450 a month. I pay the taxes, I pay the insurance, and I pay any maintenance costs. So all of a sudden, you've got an instant deal with cash flow and equity built in, and you didn't have to put any money down. Now, there's what I want you to do. I'm going to give you guys an action step. By this time, many of you guys have already got some deals coming down the pipeline. You've done your bandit signs and your direct mail. You've got deals, and you see so many deals that come close but don't quite meet the wholesale numbers. And you're not ready to fix and flip yet in some cases, and you're just trying to get some wholesale deals coming down the pipeline, but you've got some deals in the pipeline that aren't quite cheap enough. This is the perfect scenario. So I want you to stop for a second. I want you to go back through and review this phrase so that you can review any of the deals that you have right now that you think this would work on, that were tighter deals, but all of a sudden now that you have this information, you think you could make them work for lease options. So stop, go through your and review some of the deals you have on your plate, see if these numbers work, and we'll be back in a sec. Okay, guys, it's time for an action step. Okay, so we're back. So you just went through any buying opportunities where you can create tight deals and actually make those lease options now. So now you're not wasting any deals. You're profiting from every possible avenue that you can. So let's talk about the sell when we talk about lease options. Okay, and this is where, if I had to guess, maybe when I do the lease options, maybe 20% of my lease option deals are buying them, and 80% is selling them. So if I do 10 lease options, 8 of them will be selling lease options and 2 of them will be buying. Why is that? Well, because I turn a lot of my deals, and I think you guys will discover the same thing, I turn a lot of my rental properties into lease options. And the reason why is the numbers are incredible when you sell a property with a lease option. You're basically, like I said before, there's 2 things that can ruin your rental property returns. One is maintenance, and the other is vacancy. Okay? When you do a lease option, you eliminate both of those. Why? Because when you sell a property on a lease option, that tenant that now lives in the property is now paying for all the maintenance. And because they have the buyer mindset, they stay in that property longer than maybe they stay in it forever and cash you out. And maybe they just stay in it, and we're going to talk some percentages in a little bit on how many people actually default and move out. But they generally stay in it much longer than the average, just regular renter. So every time you have a rental property, there's a certain percentage of those properties that you're going to want to turn into lease options so that you can sell and cash those out. Now, one thing to remember is when you're doing these lease options, and you have your portfolio of properties. Let's say, you've built up over time. Let's say 5 years goes by and you've got 50 rental properties, okay? You may not want to do all of them on a lease option, or you may want to do all of them on a lease option. Personally, I kind of like keeping a certain percentage of my properties as just regular rentals, so I can capture that eventual equity of the property. So if you really think about it, what are some of let's just talk about that for a second. So what are the pros when you sell a property on a rent to own or lease option? What are the pros? Well, you get a down payment. How much is the down payment on average? I'd say, if I had to say an average, $2,000 to $5,000. Now, it can be much higher than this. I've gotten as high as $18,000 on a lease option. I just got an email today on a property I listed on the MLS for sale. I bought the property on a lease option with no money down. I listed it on the MLS, and I had an MLS buyer. Actually, the realtor contacted my realtor, and there's a buyer that wants to put $15,000 down on this property. So I bought the property with no money down. I listed it to flip and sell, but a buyer came along and wants to do a lease option. I'm more than happy to do that with $15,000 down. So you get a down payment. That's a pro. The second thing is you get cash flow. You're getting monthly cash flow. You're creating wealth with this technique. The next thing you've got, another pro you have, is when you get cashed out. Generally speaking, when somebody cashes you out, you're cashing yourself out. You're getting cashed out at full ARV. Okay? So you've got, in a lot of cases, you don't, in 99% of the cases, you don't have any realtor commissions. So if you listed a house for, on average, let's just say in most markets, if you listed a house with a realtor, if you listed it for sale, and it was worth $100,000, and you listed it for $100,000, you're going to get a buyer that's going to come on average, I'm just using average numbers, you're going to get a buyer that's going to offer you $97,000, okay? Because they're trying to get a deal. Okay, so you're going to get it for $97,000, but you got to pay realtor commissions on that of 6%. So 6%, you're basically knocking off, just for easy math, another $6,000, 6 to 7%. So now you're really getting $91,000. So that's a $9,000 cut off of full ARV is what you're getting when you buy or when you sell a property in the MLS versus doing on a lease option. On a lease option, you're going to get that full, in most cases, you're going to get full asking price. Now, why is that? Well, because if somebody buys a house from you for $100,000 and that's what it's worth and they're buying it on a lease option, they get 2 years or 3 years. I'm going to teach you the years in a minute. I do 3 years in most cases. So they're getting today's price, but they don't have to pay you for 3 years. Meaning, what if after 3 years the property went up in value? In most cases, in a lot of markets, real estate always goes up and down, but in most cases, you're selling and you're buying these properties at a discount, and you're buying these rental type properties towards the low of the market. So there's a big sweep going up over the next several years. So in most cases, the property will go up in value. So, at $100,000, if it's worth $100,000, they're getting it for $100,000, but in 3 years it could be worth $110,000. But they're getting it for the $100,000, so they'll pay your asking price. So you get cashed out at ARV, which is full price, but you don't have the realtor commissions, and they're not working you down off of the asking price in most cases. So I call that a pro. So you get a down payment, you get cash flow, and you get full ARV, because you don't necessarily need to have a realtor. If there's no realtor involved and you find that lease option buyer, and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes, you find that person on your own, there's never a realtor involved. So pro, there's also another pro, no maintenance, no vacancy. So you get steady cash flow, okay? This cash flow number is what it is. It's the same every month. So we like that about that. Now, what another pro? What if the tenant leaves? So if the tenant vacates, what happens to this $2,000 to $5,000? You keep it. This is non-refundable. This is to have the option to buy this property through a lease option. It's an option payment. It's literally your option payment, although we call it a down payment. So you get to keep that. If somebody puts down $5,000 and they stay there for 2.5 years and call you one day and say, "Hey, we're moving out," you kept that money. You kept the cash flow every month. Any cash flow, you keep that. You enjoyed no maintenance and no vacancy. Now the tenant vacates. Now, my intention is I love it when a tenant buyer actually cashes me out. I prefer that because I want that big bulk, $20,000 or $30,000 that I'm going to get when it sells. I love that money. But if the tenant vacates, guess what you do? 2.5 years from now, the house is now worth $110,000. Let's say it's worth $110,000. You do the same thing over again. Now you sell it at $110,000. You get another $2,000 to $5,000 down, and you start the process over again. It's a best case scenario. So it's one of those things where there's a lot of pros. Now, what are the cons? Let's talk about the cons to a lease option. There aren't very many. So the cons are you eventually get cashed out. So I just said that getting cashed out was great. Now I'm saying you getting cashed out as a con. Well, what I mean is you don't get the long-term cash flow, and you don't get the long-term equity. Sorry, my handwriting's a little messy there. So if you do get cashed out, if you held a property for 20 years, 20 years from now, you're likely the rent is going to be twice as high, because if you take an average 3% rent increase over the year, which is what the national average is, then that rent at $1,000 a month in 20 years will be $2,000 a month. So your maintenance or your cash flow is going to be insane. But also your long-term equity. So now, if that property goes up 3% in value over the next 20 years, it doubles in size. Plus, if you bought that property and put financing on it and did a 20-year amortization, meaning you got a mortgage that paid off in 20 years, well then imagine that. And you bought a house for $100,000. Let's just talk about this for a second. You bought it for $100,000. And in 20 years, it went up 3% a year. Now it's worth $200,000. Is that real? Those real numbers that could really happen? Yeah, those. I've been in real estate for 10 years now, and I've seen my rents go up dramatically, and I've seen all the values of my properties go up dramatically. This really is the number. So now you've got a house worth $20,000, and you had a 20-year amortization, and now you owe nothing. So in 20 years, it's worth $200,000, and you don't even have a mortgage. You owe $0. So your rent's double. So now your rent is $2,000 a month on this property. So you lost all that the minute you cashed it out. Okay, you got your money up front. So there are a few cons. Those are it. That's why in my portfolio, I would prefer to have, if I could do it perfectly, my portfolio would be 50% lease options and 50% rental properties as far as the properties I was holding. Because I want those big down payments. I want no maintenance. I want no vacancy. I love the consistent cash flow. And I want to get cashed out in 3 years on each one of those lease options and make that chunk of money that's 20 to 30 grand. But at the same time, I want to capture some of this long term. So some people, some investors I know, some of my friends, they do all of their deals or lease options. Every time they get a deal, they put it up as a lease option and they sell it, they sell it to a tenant buyer on a rent to own as a lease option, and they're massively wealthy and they've got amazing cash flow And they don't care about, the missing out on this because they're getting those down payments up front, that massive cash flow. They're buying more and more properties, adding to their portfolio. And some of the wealthiest people I know turn their entire portfolios into lease options. So, I just think it's an amazing opportunity, the lease options with, the win-win scenario between where you can buy them as lease options, you can sell them as lease options, and there's so many win-wins on both sides. It truly is an amazing, it's an amazing technique. So let's jump into, I'm going to talk about your return when you do a lease option and you sell it as a lease option. So your ROI. So you're going to have a rent payment. It's called $1,000 a month. Okay? You're going to have taxes. Let's call that $150 a month. You're going to have insurance. Call that $50 a month. Keep in mind, you guys are going to have your real numbers. You're going to figure all this. I'm just using this for an example. Maintenance, $0. Tenant buyer pays for all the maintenance. Vacancy, $0. And then if you've got debt against the property and you got a mortgage, you're going to have that mortgage payment. Okay? So the mortgage, let's just call it $300 a month for this particular example. So $100 a month minus $150 minus $50 minus $300. Now the other advantage with lease options are, I'm real big on having property management companies manage my properties. Now I own my own property management company. Nobody can manage your properties as well as you, but if you don't know what you're doing, it's better to get a good property management company involved. And a lease option's amazing because the biggest thing about a lease option or the biggest thing about a manager managing your properties is collecting the rent. Sometimes if tenants are paying late, you're chasing. You don't want to mess with that in the course of your day. The biggest thing is maintenance. You don't want to get a call at 2 o'clock in the morning. My heat's out. My toilet's plugged up. I've got, I heard a noise, whatever it is, or my roof's leaking. You don't want those phone calls. I want to push maintenance off to a property management company. Well, in this scenario, you don't need a property manager. So you can literally collect the payments yourself very easily because it's going to be more consistent payments. You're going to have very little management involved. Most property management, the whole labor-intensive part of it is maintenance. You don't have that. So you don't even have management. So you got 1,000 minus 150 minus 50 minus 300, for example. So that's 500. So this particular property is going to cash flow $500 a month. Now, if you were in a regular rental, you're going to have maintenance of $70 a month, vacancy of $50 a month, and you're going to have a property management cost of $100 a month. It's going to vastly change your cash flow. But in this particular case, you got $500 a month. Now, if you figure out, take that $500 per month, and we always figure it on an annual basis. You take it times 12, you got $6,000 per month. Now, let's say when you bought this property, let's say you bought it, let's say it was worth $100,000. And you got it for $65,000, and you had to put $20,000 into repairs. Actually, let's say 15 because it's a rental. It's a little bit less, and the tenants are going to be doing what they want to make the property nice. Generally speaking, on a lease option, tenants will, because they're a tenant buyer, they'll tend to improve the property on their own. So you're all in for $80,000 in this particular scenario. So let's say you got financing and refinanced out 80% of your investment. So you got a loan for $64,000. Okay. So your actual down payment is $16,000. So you've got out-of-pocket expense of $16,000. Now, again, you could do a refinance and maybe pull back all of your cash, but in this particular case, I'm just using something so that we don't have to figure it and just say it's an infinite return. Let's just say that you've got 20% of your investment tied up into the deal. You've got $6,000 coming in. So what we need to do is take 6,000 divided by. So we take 6K divided by 16K to get our actual ROI. So to figure out, let me grab my calculator here. So we take $6,000 for your annual cash flow divided by 16,000 is what you had out of pocket, and that comes out to a 37.5% ROI. Your cash on cash return is 37.5%. That is unbelievable. That is an amazing return. So that's the power of selling these deals on a lease option. That same deal, your return is half that when it's just a rental property. And we haven't even talked about the rest of the return. That's just on the monthly cash flow. Let's talk about the rest of the return. If we've got our down payment. Let's say we got another $5,000 down. Okay, so we got $5,000 down, and now instead of the $16,000 that I said that we had out of pocket, now it's only $11,000 because of that down payment. So let's figure that out. So now what's that return come to? So now we take $6,000 divided by $11,000, and our return goes up to 54.5%. That is an unbelievable return. It's so hard to achieve a return like that anywhere in the world on any type of investment. I want you guys to really understand the power behind this technique. So now we got one step further to go to. In 2 to 3 years, let's say we did a 3-year deal. In 3 years, if we said that this house was worth $100,000 in 3 years, and we had $80,000 in it. Okay, I know our loan that we said was $64,000, but we have $80,000 in it. Now you have to take the $5,000 away because they put that down. If they cash you out, that $5,000 goes against the purchase price, so that would knock that down to $95,000. But you'd still have another day in 3 years, a cash out of $15,000 minus a rent credit. And we're going to get into that monthly rent credit in a little bit. But basically, I give a tenant buyer, somebody that's buying the property, or that they live in the property, they're going to cash me out, I give them a $50 rent credit. So, it's not a ton of money. $50 over a year is $600. If they did that for 3 years, it's $1,800. So you enjoyed a 54. Actually, that's not a dollar sign. You enjoyed a 54% return on your money for 3 years, which is unbelievable. And then you got cashed out, and you made gross $15,000 minus $1,800 for your rent credit, minus any closing costs. But you're still getting over $10,000 return cashed out, not counting your $500 a month for 3 years. So, you got that $500 a month for 3 years. That's $6,000 times 3 is $18,000. So you made, let's just call it after closing cost and rent credit, this was $10,000. $10,000 plus $18,000 in cash flow. It's an unbelievable return. That's the power of the lease option. And it's a win because the tenant bought a house at today's price, but didn't have to cash out for 3 years and got to own the home for a small down payment. That's why I love the actual sell side of lease options as well. So What I want you to do, I want you guys to stop here. We're going to do an action step. I want you to go back and practice these numbers. And, now you've got some deals in front of you that you looked at the last action step we did that could potentially work. Figure out what your cash-on-cash return is and figure out what some of your ROIs will be on these lease options and start getting excited about some of the potential here. So stop for a minute, go through your deals, run through this math, get good at it, and we'll be back in a sec. Okay, guys, it's time for an action step. Okay, so now let's talk, when you're doing lease options, let's talk about the legal contracts and the legal way to set this up. Now, this is an important part because I've seen a lot of people do this wrong, and the proper way to do this is there should be 2 contracts with every lease option. There should be a lease contract, basically a lease agreement, and there should also be a purchase agreement. Now, if you just built this all into one lease option contract, one agreement, what happens is if your tenant buyer stops paying, now you've got a foreclosure if it's all in one contract. And the way I do it, and the way I was taught by my attorney to do it, is you have 2 different contracts. That way, if the person stops paying, it's just a simple eviction. A foreclosure could cost tens of thousands of dollars and you not getting any money for, a year or 2 years. An eviction, the person can be out in 30 days. So it's very important that you do it this way. So let's talk about it. So if you've got 2 contracts, you got your lease agreement. Now, in your lease agreement, you're going to have, you'll have a 3-year lease agreement, so it'll go for 3 years. You'll have your monthly rent payment. Now, one important thing that I do is I don't want my tenant buyer to pay the taxes and to pay the insurance. Because what if they stopped paying? What if I got in all of a sudden 2 years goes by, the tenant hasn't paid taxes? Now, I can call and follow up and check the county courthouse website, and we do that in some certain circumstances, but it adds one extra step. So why not just build it all into the monthly rent that they're paying you? Then you know that your taxes and your insurance never go without getting paid. I mean, what if your tenant stopped paying insurance and there was a fire, 30 days later? All of a sudden, now you've got a total loss on your hands and you got no insurance. So you want to make sure your monthly rent includes, you build in your taxes and insurance. Then you're going to give a rent credit. Now, what's a rent credit? Well, a rent credit it's a way for, this tenant to build equity. So they know that every month they're paying rent, but some of that's going towards the purchase price. Now, they don't get that rent credit every month in the form of a check. They get it at the end. If they end up, executing this lease agreement as agreed, then this purchase agreement goes into effect, and they get that $50 rent credit against the purchase agreement. It's very important the way it's worded. Also, too, it states in the lease agreement that the tenant pays for all maintenance. Now, that's one of the most important and one of the best parts about this lease option is the tenant is paying for all the maintenance. So you've got to make sure that that's stated. Now, the cool part is I'm gonna basically allow you guys to copycat off of my lease option agreement. So, and I want you guys to use this example. But at the same time, I want you, because every state's different, and I haven't done deals in all 50 states. I've done it in a few select states. And in lease options, most of my lease options have been in Illinois and Iowa. And since that's the case, I know my contracts work really well there. But I don't know about some of these other states that I've never done deals in. So I want you to take my agreements. You've already got your real estate attorney on standby because you've already went through, filtered out, found the ones that are the best real estate friendly, investor friendly attorneys. You're going to take my agreements, you're going to print them off, and you're going to send them to your attorney, and you're going to say, will these work in my state? So that way, if they need to change any wording or modify them in any way they can, they might say, hey, they're great, just go ahead. They might make some suggestions, and that's great too. So I want you to don't just use mine and then start using it. Just take that extra step and just tell your real estate attorney that you want to use these for your lease options. Make sure that they're good with them in your state. So, make sure that that's the case, and then you'll know that you're all good to go. So then in your purchase agreement, you're going to have the option price, the sales. That means the sales price. So in your down payment as well. So in your when that person goes to exercise their option, their down payment is also applied, and that'll be down here. So we can't forget the option payment. So that's basically their deposit that goes towards their purchase price when they exercise. So if they started out with a $100,000 house, they put $5,000 down as their option payment. That comes off their purchase price when they go to execute the purchase agreement and actually cash you out. So make sure that you have these set up. I'm going to take a short break and let you guys do this next action step, which is take a look at the attached agreements and make sure, print them off, go through them, make sure that you get them over to your real estate attorney. Tell them that you want to use these. Also, too, I've got a video below that I'm going to actually have Amanda showing you guys how to fill these out correctly. So take an action step now and go through those documents in that video, and we'll be back in a minute. Okay, guys, watch this video, and then it's time for an action step, and I'll be back as soon as the video is done. Okay, so I wanted to go through the lease option agreement. Basically, we take a standard lease agreement and we add one paragraph that helps tie this lease agreement into the option to buy, to make the lease option. So then that lease agreement goes with, that option agreement ties in your normal purchase agreement. So you're using the same purchase agreement you would if you were buying a property. So nothing changes on the purchase agreement side. The only thing is there's one paragraph added to the end of the lease agreement. I'm going to go through that now. Okay, so the option to buy. So in this particular example, the rent, I'll just go through it and we can talk through it from there. So the option to buy. The tenant has paid the landlord $1,000 for the option to purchase the property. So basically that is, what's the amount that would be put in there as far as the option agreement, the deposit amount. So if you're charging $5,000, it would say $5,000 in that point. So this option payment is non-refundable, but the payment shall be a credit against the purchase price if the option to buy is exercised by the tenant. So remember, with a lease option, the tenant has the choice of either exercising the option or not. At the end of the agreement, they can walk away. So in this particular case, there was $1,000 they gave for the option to buy. It's non-refundable. So then next, during the term of this rental agreement and any extensions thereof, and if the tenant is not in default under the terms of the rental agreement, the tenant shall have the option to buy the premises for $100,000. So in that case, whatever that option price is, like if you're selling the property for $100 or $75,000 or $150 or $200, whatever it is, that goes there where this agreement shows $100,000. And remember, one of the key things is it says in here if the tenant is not in default. So if the tenant defaults, they don't have the option to buy. They lose. For example, if a tenant stops paying you, you don't have to do a foreclosure on them. You just simply do an eviction because now they're now in default of the agreement. So if the tenant must give the landlord at least 30 days written notice to exercise this option, tenant shall receive a $200 credit against the purchase price for each month rent is paid on time. Now, this particular example says $200 a month. We usually do $50 a month. That's my average. So that rent credit, that monthly rent credit would go in there where it says $200. Okay, after the purchase option is exercised, the party shall enter into the standard real estate contract for residential property, which is commonly used in the county that the real estate is located. So that last sentence helps tie this into the purchase agreement. And then landlord and tenant sign, and you're good to go. That's all there is to these lease options. That's all you need is that extra paragraph added into your normal lease agreement. And then that ties to your purchase agreement, which gives the rest of the terms of the agreement. So anyway, I just wanted to show you how easy it is to do a lease option and what the paperwork that's required. That should be everything you need to go from there. Okay, so we're back. So let's talk about how do you find some of these lease option tenant buyers? Well, there's several ways that we use. If you follow these same ways, you'll have a lot of success at getting a lot more lease option buyers than probably what you need. The first thing is Craigslist. So, by far nationwide, Craigslist is still probably the number one spot that people go to when they're looking for a rental property. So we like to post ads in Craigslist in the for rent section, and we actually do it in the for rent section and we do it in the for sale section, and we put rent to own. You can do a generic ad or you can do a specific ad. If you don't have one yet, property yet, and you're just trying to find see what the demand is in your area for lease options buyers, just do a generic ad. And I've got an example below on the exact ad we use. You can copy and paste it and use that ad. And if you've got a property and you're trying to find a tenant, and you're willing to do a lease option or just rent the property out, you'll list it both ways. You'll create an ad on Craigslist just for a straight rental, and you'll create an ad on Craigslist for a rent to own. So you could be looking for either or at the same time. And we've got some examples below that you guys can just copy and paste. The other thing is you can put it on the MLS. One of the biggest things with the MLS is you're going to always have people that are looking for a property that may not have perfect credit. And if you don't have perfect credit, you guys know that, a lot of times you can't get a mortgage, okay? And if you can't get a mortgage, you can't buy a house. Most of these first-time home buyers that would be interested in these types of properties don't have the cash for paying cash for the properties. So you can go through the MLS and you can call your realtor, say, hey, I've got a property. I want to list it as a rent to own or a lease option. And you can do that right in the MLS. The thing to remember is if you do that, you're going to pay commission. Now, the cool part is instead of you being the only person that's looking for that tenant buyer, you've got the entire MLS. Could be hundreds of agents looking for that tenant buyer. So you want to make sure that if you do that, I would personally try the Craigslist thing first, see what kind of activity you get, then, because it's free, versus paying commission. So how do I pay the commission? Well, there's a couple different things. So realtors, they work for free. They don't get paid until something closes. So what I do is I'll pay, let's say you work out a deal where you say, hey, I'll pay you 6% commission off this sale, okay? Well, the biggest thing is you've got to make sure that your down payment is big enough to cover that commission. So let me give you an example. Let's say, for example, this is a $100,000 house, okay? And that's what you're trying to sell it for as a lease option. Well, on a 6% commission, that's $6,000 in commission. So if they are only giving you $5,000 down, well, that's not going to be good enough. So what I do, there's two ways to do this. One is you can work out a deal. I usually will pay 50% of the commission up front to the realtor and 50% when the buyer cashes me out. So in other words, you would need $3,000 at least down to pay the realtor commission. Now, one thing about it is if you put the property on the MLS, more than likely you'll actually get a bigger down payment. So I'll try the Craigslist thing. I'll put it at $5,000 down. If I go and list it with a realtor and get it on the MLS, where I have all these other salespeople trying to close that deal, I might change this to $10,000 down. So generally, realtors generally can find buyers that will put more down, which allows you more money to go in your pocket after you pay the commission. And then they're highly incentivized to work with this buyer so that they get the other half of their commission. That's the other part of, the nice part of, paying them half down and half when it closes. It's a lot more likely to close. And remember what I said before, my intention is I want these buyers to cash me out. I get a lot bigger payday if that happens. We'll talk about, having those guys help you in a couple other ways in a minute. But that's how I work that deal. Pay half down, half when they close. Try to get a little bit more money for the down payment once you put it on the MLS. What's another way we find lease option tenant buyers? Well, you can go to your current tenants. If you've already got a property, let's say you've got 5 rental properties that you've got right now, you can go through and ask those tenants that are currently living there, hey, would you like to buy this property? I'm interested in selling, and you're the first on the list that that I would prefer buy the property. And you can, if they say, well, I just don't have good enough credit right now, you can tell them, hey, I'm going to hook you up with a mortgage broker and a credit repair specialist to fix your credit. In an 18 months, you could turn around and buy me. This could be your own home. That's a great way because, again, you're not paying any commission and you don't even have any vacancy. If they don't want to do it, don't stress on it. But at the same time, they know that it's out there. A year from now, something could change and they could come to you and say, hey, remember a year ago when we talked about doing a lease option? Well, hey, I'm interested in doing that now. So talk to your current tenants if you've already got rentals and convert those rental properties into lease options. The other thing, too, social media is very, very powerful. You can put ads on social media, also offering that you got houses that are available rent to own. We've got a sample also below that you guys can check out and copy and use what we're doing. Again, below you can see that we have a little script that you can use that when you're talking to your tenants or mailing them a letter that you can use as well. Just copy what we're doing since we know it works. The other thing too is let's say you don't want to list it on the MLS, but you want those realtors working for you. You can do this as well. You can just contact your realtor, and this is the conversation I've had 1,000 times, and it always gets people excited. You can go to the broker of a let's say it's a brokerage of Remax or Keller Williams or something along those lines, and let's say that there's 50, 80 agents that work in that office. You can call up the broker and say, hey, have you recently had any potential buyers that your realtors worked really hard with, did all this work, found them a house, and then they couldn't get qualified with the bank, or something went wrong at the end and they couldn't close because of something on their credit? They're always going to say, yes, that happens all the time. Just say, well, listen, I've got a property or I'm working on a property. Whether if you have one, great, use that property. If you're working on one, you'll find the demand. But just say, I've got a property that I'm going to offer as a rent to own. Basically, if you give me $5,000 down, here's the monthly rent. It's an amazing property. Check it out. Could you shoot this out to your agents and see if there's any interest? And those agents are going to grab the phone and pick up and start calling all of the people they've worked with in the last 12 months or a couple of years potentially that they worked really hard with, they spent all this time with, they've showed them all these properties, they've got a property under contract and they couldn't close or the person couldn't quite get pre-qualified. Now all of a sudden they've got an option. There's not that many of these out there. These lease options are amazing because there really isn't you don't have that much competition. So that's the other thing you can do if you don't want to list it, but you want to enlist all of the help from the realtors. That's an amazing way. Every time I get one that I want to do a lease option with, I call a realtor, and we always seem to find somebody pretty fast. So get those hundreds of people working for you out there that are with the real estate companies. So those are the best ways that we use to find lease option buyers. Again, you're going to find out there's a lot of buyers out there that just don't have good enough credit and they're close, or they just don't have, they're just not qualified with a bank. So you'll find that you'll have a lot of options. Okay, so a lot of times people say, well, what's the cash out rate? Well, I'd say on average, most of these people that cash you out are going to default. Or most of the people that do lease options are probably going to default. Not really default. They have the option. It's called a lease option. They have the option of cashing you out or not. There's nothing wrong with them living there for 3 years or 2 years or however many years you decide to set it up. There's nothing wrong with them getting to the end of the 3 years and then calling you and saying, hey, I decided not to buy it. That's their option. That's why they call it a lease option. But I'd say about 20% of the people will actually cash you out. It's a very low percentage. So, but what I found is the higher the down payment, the higher the likelihood of being cashed out. In my experience, anything over $10,000, that down payment gets over 10 grand, and this number shoots up dramatically. Again, I had somebody do $18,000 down on one of my properties, and he cashed me out in 6 months. So it's one of those things that if you do a $2,000 down payment, it's only twice as much or so as what a security deposit is on a rental. So there's a lot more likelihood that person will default. So if you want to increase your cash out rate, increase the down payment. But remember, if you get too high of a down payment, you'll have a lot fewer people that would be able to afford the property. So that's the kind of the give and take there, something to remember. The other thing too is if you really do want to help these people be able to buy that house and cash you out and get that big payment in a couple of years, then you need to find a local credit repair company, and you need to find a local mortgage broker. The best way to do it, I'll teach you my little secret technique to it, is to call some of the larger brokerages, whether it be Remax or Keller Williams or one of the larger brokerages that have, 50, 80 plus agents in the office, and ask them if they have an in-house credit repair specialist, and ask them if they have an in-house mortgage broker, or they can refer you to a credit repair person or mortgage broker. A lot of the bigger ones do, because they've realized that that's an important piece to making sure that all of these houses actually sell. They don't want their agents working with a bunch of unqualified buyers that can't close. They want to utilize their time the best they can and make sure that these people close. So that's what we do. We actually call the larger brokerages in the area, and we kind of piggyback off of their team, set up a meeting, go in and meet them, and then start driving your lease option buyers. The minute you, especially set this up in the beginning, because as you're talking to some of these lease option buyers from Craigslist, 50% of the people are going to call because they're kind of interested, but they don't think they'll ever be able to cash you out. And their biggest concern, if you step back and look at a lease option person, a buyer, somebody who's living in this house, their biggest concern is that they've heard all these stories that, these people have gotten done lease options, rent to owns, and they put money down, and the evil landlord, tried to do everything they could to kick them out of the house and take their money. So that's their fear. That's what they're thinking. Just imagine if you can say, to that potential lease option buyer, listen, I totally understand your fears. That's why I have gone out of the way. I'm going to introduce you to somebody that can help fix your credit. I'm going to introduce you to a mortgage broker that can line you up with a really good mortgage so that you can cash me out and you can call this place your own home, in 3 years or less. And always remind them that, hey, if these guys can fix your credit in 6 months, then you can cash me out then. If you can get this mortgage broker in line and get you into a good mortgage faster so that you have the confidence you can cash me out, you can start helping them work on it right away. So those are some of the things that I do to help to make sure that these people can cash me out. Again, my whole goal isn't for them to move out. My goal is I'd love to have 100% cash out rate. Again, it's probably never going to happen because things come up and people move. And they just decide not to buy the house, and that's okay. But anyway, that's how those lease options work. I love lease options for buying properties if I want to do a no money down scenario, and I love selling them to my tenants, and my tenants being the tenant buyer and cashing me out. I think lease options are probably the most amazing technique out there. Do as many of them as you can. Really focus on your rentals. Knowing that, this cash out rate isn't 100%, you can attempt to do this with every single rental property you get, knowing that maybe half of them will fall out and you can use those as your long-term rentals, and the other half will cash you out and you'll get down payment money and cash flow and big chunks of cash when they cash you out in a couple, 3 years. So anyway, I hope that the lease option segment was amazing. I think if you guys go out and do the things that I just taught you to do, you'll have a ton of opportunities with it, and you'll be able to create some nice down payments, some cash flow, and some big cash out days. Get them working for you. Get them to the point where, every single month you got another tenant cashing you out. And next thing you know, you wake up one day and you got $20,000 a month coming to you every single month for the next several years. So, I hope this section was amazing. I hope the whole reps program was amazing. I want you guys to take action. I want you to go through and really make sure that these action steps are something that you followed. Go back through the program if you need to. Follow it step by step. We want to make sure you're successful, and we'll see you soon.